A clipboard trembles, a camera phone starts recording, and a notice lands like a verdict on a front door. Remove the flag, repaint the porch, pay the fine, or lose everything under a rule no one remembers voting for. Overnight, a quiet cul-de-sac turns into a battlefield of measuring tapes, anonymous complaints, and letters stamped "Final Warning." As a homeowner who's done nothing more than honor a promise is pushed to the edge by people who call it policy and pretend it isn't personal. The rules shift, the deadlines shrink, and each correction breeds another citation, as if the punishment was the point all along, not the paint color or the planter box on the step. Neighbors who used to wave now look away. The board smiles for the newsletter while adding fees in fine print, each line a little tighter around a life that used to feel safe. And then one morning, something changes. A sealed envelope slides under the door, a car idles across the street longer than it should, and the board announces an emergency vote that sounds less like order and more like a trap. By the time the lights come on in the clubhouse, there's no room left for misunderstandings, only receipts, witnesses, and a choice that will expose what this HOA really stands for. So when the gavel falls, who will be judged? The homeowner who refused to bow, or the rules that forgot what they were for? On weekday mornings, the cul-de-sac wakes like a routine that has learned to trust itself. Sprinklers hiss to life, garage doors roll up in tidy sequence, and coffee steam curls above porches where neighbors nod without needing words. Children loop their bikes in smooth figure eights around mailboxes, and the same joggers pass at the same minute, tracing the same line along sidewalks edged to regulation crispness. It is peaceful in a way that feels earned, the kind of quiet that convinces people to trade city noise for HOA dues and rules that promise order like a product with a satisfaction guarantee. In the second house on the left, behind a pergola layered with morning glory vines, lives someone who measures success by small, steady rituals. Tools cleaned before sundown, grass clippings bagged, oil changed before the dashboard light can even ask. The neighbors know the lawn is square, the hedges are exact, and by dusk, a worn pair of boots sits by the door, waiting for the next day to be respected into existence. The house itself carries a hum that no one hears unless they stop. A hum of discipline, of care taken where no one is watching, of weekends given to repairs and letters written to people who rarely reply. Inside the garage, on a shelf that is always dusted, a folded flag and a brace of medals rest, not as display but as promise, kept for years without asking for applause. There's a photo album that never makes the coffee table, stacked beneath car manuals and a binder labeled Documents, where everything has its place, including years of paid dues and spotless inspections. The mailbox is checked the same way every day, with the same quick glance down the street, as if the ritual itself keeps things unremarkable and safe. It is a life stitched together by reliability, a framework that turns neighbors into a community simply by showing up and maintaining the sunwold, ground they share. Around here, rules are the currency of belonging, and compliance buys peace. The HOA newsletter arrives every month, the kind with seasonal clip art and polite reminders that feel like a smile with teeth. A new header appears near the bottom. Upcoming updates to community standards, which no one studies because updates come like weather, inevitable, usually mild. The board hosts quarterly socials with paper napkins in HOA colors, where punch bowls sit beside sign-up sheets no one reads unless they're already on the board. People believe in the promise that if everyone follows the line will protect them. Still, small signals begin to disturb the repetition, so faint they look like coincidence. A neighbor 2 doors down finds a note about a trash can that lingered 7 minutes past pickup. A porch planter, once applauded in the spring newsletter, is suddenly not in harmony with the community palette and quietly disappears from the next photo spread. The friendly wave from the woman with the clipboard becomes a nod that studies instead of welcomes. At the bulletin board by the clubhouse, a new laminated sheet appears. Common area use appearance guidelines, with a line about attire in shared spaces that no one can remember seeing before. It reads bureaucratic, bland, and oddly specific in places that don't feel like they needed to be. The resident in the second house on the left doesn't notice those hints right away because days still start the same. Porch swept, mail collected, flag flown with quiet gratitude as the sun crests over roofs aligned like printed rows. The flag catches light differently at certain angles, and sometimes the cul-de-sac seems to pause for it, a breath of meaning in a neighborhood devoted to appearances. On weekends, the garage opens to neat shelves and a workbench that smells faintly of pine and machine oil, an order born from habit rather than fear. In that order, there's room for neighbors, help with a flat tire, a ladder lent without hesitation, a snow shovel left where it will be needed before it's asked for. It is kindness done quietly, the type that builds trust slowly and doesn't ask for change. Across the street, the board's new president has a particular clarity about how things should look. She favors comparison photos, before and afters, where the afters are a little colder but undeniably aligned. Her clipboard holds checklists with boxes that feel better when they're filled, and she likes to say that standards make everyone's home more valuable, as if value were a synonym for virtue. She sees the neighborhood not as a collection of lives, but as a document that needs tightening, and she is good at tightening. People say she is efficient, which is not the same thing as kind. The first letter comes in a neutral envelope with precise font and no signature, a courtesy notice that references recent clarifications to guidelines and invites timely alignment. It does not accuse so much as narrow, describing dimensions and setbacks, colors and placements, in language that sounds like it's meant to soothe the very concerns it sharpens. There is a due date that feels harmless because it's a month away, and a phone number that goes to a voicemail with a cheerful tone. As the letter ends with a sentence about community harmony, and the word harmony does a lot of work. On the fridge, it looks temporary, like a grocery list. But paperwork moves faster than seasons when the right person is pushing it. At the next board meeting, the seating is the same, but the mood is different. Chairs are closer to the table, questions answered before they're asked, updates adopted in batches like a consent form no one remembers reading. A slide on the projector includes the attire line again, this time bolded beneath respectful presentation in shared spaces, a phrase that says less than it decides. A few people exchange looks that don't quite become conversations. Afterward, emails go out with sentences that sound friendly until the second read, and a new round of courtesy notices follows, addressing small things that never used to matter. At home, the binder labeled Documents gains a new tab, and the envelope pile grows. The resident logs dates, scans letters, and files receipts, not out of fear but habit, the same habit that keeps the garage immaculate and the lawn measured. It feels like insurance against misunderstanding, a way to respect the process that claims to protect them. Even now, the cul-de-sac looks untroubled from a distance, like a postcard. Up close, the edges are sharper, the nods quicker, the glances longer, the newsletter brighter and somehow less warm. It starts with a notice that reads like a reminder and lands like a verdict, a clarification to a guideline that was never voted on. Now retroactively enforceable with a deadline that already feels too close to meet without turning life into a checklist. The line about attire in shared spaces sits in the middle, framed by bland phrasing as if it belongs there, as if it always did, as if the community had merely forgotten what it agreed to. It is the first time the resident understands the difference between a page and a rule, between a rule and a blade. The binder is opened, the tabs updated, the letters scanned and filed, because organization is how a person tells himself that reason will be enough. In the cul-de-sac, nothing looks different yet, but attention has turned. It is not the same attention as a wave or a nod. 2 days later, a friendly neighbor who used to linger with a joke leaves a printed screenshot in the mailbox. A thread from the community forum that doesn't name the homeowner but makes it obvious. A series of posts about standard slipping and exceptions that invite chaos. The photos are cropped just enough to look incriminating. the angles chosen to make normal life appear careless. A list of small issues accompanies the thread. The flag displayed past dusk, the planter set 2 inches forward of the post, a curb paint scrape discovered like a scandal. None of it matters, not by itself, not in the way that makes any rational person lose sleep. But none of it is meant to matter on its own. It is meant to accumulate, to layer, to create a hum that drowns out the question of whether any of this is right. The next notice arrives with a fine attached, visible through the envelope window like a price tag. The code cited is older than the current board president, a dusty line about presentational harmony that could mean anything, and therefore K by N mean whatever is needed. The due date is short enough to force action and long enough to prevent a clean refusal. The language suggests compliance would be appreciated and necessary, using courteous words to deliver coercion. The resident reads it twice, then adds it to the binder with a steady hand that shakes only afterward. Selective enforcement is not a theory but a choreography, and it looks like this. A neighbor with a kayak on the side lawn untouched. Holiday lights still draped in August. A house across the way with a basketball hoop at the curb that has never been measured. None of those homes received notices this month. The newsletter praises the board's balanced approach and features a photo of the president with a caption about safeguarding property values for all, a phrase that explains nothing and justifies everything. When people believe value is at stake, they will defend it with the language of virtue. The resident does not argue online. The resident keeps records. A meeting is scheduled, the first of many, framed as an opportunity for collaborative resolution. The room is fluorescent and slightly too cold, with chairs that creak in a way that makes the room feel smaller. The board sits aligned, papers stacked, pens clicked in unison. The attire line appears on the screen again, under a heading called Civility in Shared Spaces, which suggests the conversation has already been decided in moral terms. Comments are accepted in order, which means questions are placed behind statements and answers are placed behind the clock. The resident speaks with calm, cites bylaws and meeting minutes, asks when the line was adopted, who voted, how the change was communicated. The response is a performance of understanding that never becomes agreement. We hear you. We appreciate your concern. We will take it under advisement, all phrases that maintain and tune while withholding relief. Fines begin to scale in a way that seems mechanical until the pattern becomes personal. The first is for the out-of-harmony planter, the second for the improper flag schedule, the third for non-compliant attire in a common area, noted on a day the resident wore a uniform to carry in supplies for a memorial event at the clubhouse. The uniform is not named. The letter does not dare say the word. Instead, it references a subsection about presentation that may cause discomfort, a phrase that flips meaning without changing any words. Neighbors whisper and decide not to have heard each other. On the forum, a post about keeping politics out of shared spaces gathers likes, as if gratitude were a partisan position. It would be simpler to comply, to make the planter match, to lower the flag at the exact minute, to wear plain clothes when passing through the lobby, to become so unremarkable that the eye slips past. But the resident understands that compliance in the face of something wrong is not peace. It is permission. The binder grows. Photos, timestamps, screenshots, copies of emails that say one thing on the surface and another between the lines. A logbook begins, notated with careful handwriting that draws strength from straight edges and accurate dates. The resident's life becomes measurable because the board made the measurements the story. The board calls an emergency vote, announced on a Friday afternoon with a Monday morning deadline for comments, a classic maneuver that is not an accident. The proposal bundles multiple changes together: curb paint standards, porch decor limits, and a clarified attire expectation, which is not a rule but will be enforced like one. People who are busy, distracted, or exhausted assume this is routine. Those who pay attention see the trap, vote against the bundle, and appear to oppose safety or cleanliness. Vote for it and accept. To the attire clause that no one can justify with a straight face. The resident writes a concise response, attaches citations to previous bylaws, and sends it to the board and the distribution list, knowing that sunshine is the only disinfectant allowed here. The email bounces back from 3 addresses with autoresponders set to out of office until the day after the vote. Meanwhile, the harassment tightens in small, deniable ways. A car idles longer outside the home and then drives off when noticed. A reminder sticker appears on the trash bin, even though it was placed exactly where the chart shows. A note with no signature suggests that some of us are uncomfortable with certain displays that feel like statements, as if existence itself has been rebranded as provocation. On the same morning, the resident finds footsteps in the dewy grass that cut across the lawn from the street to the window and back. The camera doorbell shows only silhouettes that are slightly too far away to identify. The resident reaches out to a veterans liaison group, not for drama, not for escalation, but for guidance. The advice is simple. Document, remain calm, request records, ask for the exact authority for each action. The request for records becomes a turning point in tone. The board replies with procedural obstruction that looks polite in print and hostile in effect. Pages are redacted for privacy, minutes are not immediately available. Decisions are attributed to informal consensus rather than votes. The facade of process begins to show its seams. The resident does not push the facade, the resident records it. Then comes the citation that changes the gravity in the room. A major infraction for disruptive attire in a reserved space, issued after the resident helped organize seating for a memorial observance in the clubhouse. The letter claims the uniform could be construed as intimidating, a sentence that collapses respect into suspicion. It includes a larger fine and a warning that continuing non-compliance may result in suspension of common area privileges, which is the HOA's way of threatening exile without using the word. The resident reads the line twice, 3 times, feeling the cold logic of it. The people who speak of harmony are prepared to isolate the person who has done the most to keep it. A date is set for an appeals hearing. The appeals hearing is a study in theater. The board sits at a long table. The president centers herself, flanked by members who avoid eye contact but nod at the right moments. A volunteer moderator explains the rules in a tone designed to prevent interruption. Evidence is presented in a sequence that disguises its weaknesses, anecdotes presented as patterns, patterns presented as policy. The resident supplies documents that show the adoption process was flawed, that notice was insufficient, that enforcement has been selective. The moderator thanks the resident and moves to deliberation without acknowledging the substance, as if politeness can substitute for fairness. The board announces a decision to uphold the spirit of the guideline while reviewing its wording, which is a way of saying the punishment stands while the language that justified it is under revision. That night, the forum ignites with a post from a board supporter declaring the community safer and more unified after hard decisions, accompanied by a photo of the clubhouse with the caption, "Standards protect us." Comments spill out in rows, praise, relief, a few questions smothered by replies about respect and civility that redefine both terms until they are unrecognizable. Screenshots find their way into the binder. The resident's voicemail fills with numbers that hang up after 2 rings. The pressure has become ambient. It is now the air in the room. The financial strain arrives next, not because the resident cannot pay, but because paying would confirm the board's power to invent dues disguised as penalties. Late fees are layered atop fines, and administrative costs are added like garnish. A letter warns about a lien process if unresolved, using the passive voice to make the threat sound like a weather event. Another letter states that legal counsel has been consulted, a sentence placed where fear will read it twice. The resident consults counsel as well, not to strike back, but to understand the map. The advice is clinical and clear. Document, request a full record of rule adoption, track selective enforcement, prepare a formal complaint with supporting exhibits. The resident had already started. Now the work gains a spine. At the next community event, a silent test presents itself. The resident is scheduled to handle logistics for a remembrance display assembled by multiple neighbors who still care quietly while staying off the forum. The attire guideline is in effect, the fines stand, and eyes will be watching because spectacle is a form of control when process fails. The resident lays out chairs, adjusts the frame on a photo, aligns a small table where a folded flag will rest. A presence is felt at the door, the board president with the clipboard, flanked by two members carrying forms. The air tightens, people check their phones or stare at the floor. The resident finishes placing the last chair with deliberate care and stands still long enough to be noticed but not provoked. The president clears her throat and reminds the room of updated expectations, which is a warning delivered as etiquette. The resident remains attuned to detail, the ink color of the forms, the conspicuous placement of a camera on a tripod that wasn't there before, the way the word expectations does not invite consent. The event ends without incident, and for a moment it looks like the board will let the night pass in peace. Then a message appears on the projector between slides, a courtesy reminder about attire in common spaces, inserted as if it were part of the program. A murmur passes through the room, not loud enough to be called dissent, loud enough to be remembered. The board members exchange small nods that look like victories. Cliffhanger. The resident steps forward, not to confront, but to adjust the projector and remove the slide from the loop, returning the event to its purpose. An action so quiet it feels louder than an argument, and the room holds its breath. The visitors at the back of the room do not speak. They do not need to. Their posture, their stillness, the quiet certainty of people used to taking notes under pressure. This changes the air in a way the board cannot control. Observers log badge numbers, angles of cameras, placements of forms. Attention becomes a mirror that shows the room to itself. The president tightens her jaw a fraction and smiles wider, the smile of someone trying to command a narrative that has started to resist the leash. The moderator calls the hearing to order with a script meant to sound neutral while placing power in specific hands. The agenda is read like a spell: statement, evidence, deliberation, decision. The resident's name is spoken without warmth. The word infraction is repeated with just enough emphasis to stain. The board's counsel adjusts papers in neat stacks, each corner aligned, a performance of order that disguises fragility. The body language along the wall reads as witness, not audience. The president begins the presentation with slides that sparkle with the appearance of structure. A timeline appears, curated to create inevitability. Notices sent, warnings issued, opportunities offered, tolerance exhausted. The attire line is quoted as settled fact, rather than the contested add-on it has always been. The word harmony gleams on the screen, used like a shield. The president's voice grows firmer with each slide, finding rhythm in repetition. This is the cadence of people who believe process is the same thing as truth. The resident does not interrupt. The resident listens, steady as a plumb line, noting each omission, each euphemism. When the floor opens, the packet is placed on the table with two hands, not as a challenge but as a document that contains more gravity than any speech. Inside, colored tabs divide what the board has tried to blur. Timelines, policy versions, correspondence, internal emails that reveal intent. The resident begins, not with accusation, but with sequence. First, the adoption process. The resident traces the attire line's path from a clarification to a guideline to an expectation, showing dates and copies with metadata intact. Last-minute notices, Friday afternoon postings, bundles that forced yes or no answers to mixed propositions, each tactic displayed as pattern, not coincidence. The oversight case number is cited, the acknowledgement letter held up with the crest visible, the record requested read aloud in plain terms. The words due process and notice are used sparingly, precisely, like markers on a map. Second, selective enforcement. Photos show the kayak, the lights, the basketball hoop, time-stamped unchallenged, no notices issued during the same period. A table lays enforcement dates beside similar violations by others left untouched, not to shame neighbors, but to reveal design. The internal email thread appears like an X-ray. Instructions to document, even if technically compliant, to build patterns, to be vigilant about displays, all in the president's voice. The room shifts as people recognize tone and phrasing. Recognition is a form of evidence. Third, the uniform. The letter that dared not say the word is placed beside the calendar entry for the memorial event, the volunteer schedule, the sign-in sheet. The phrase could be construed as intimidating is read without inflection, and then the veteran's liaison raises a hand. Not to speak, but to nod at the packet that outlines basic protections and norms, the difference between political messaging and the recognition of service. The resident does not argue intent. The resident demonstrates effect. Silence does the rest. Counsel for the board counters with procedural language, authority delegated by bylaws, board discretion in matters of decorum, the necessity of uniform standards to avoid subjective disputes. The words are clean, the uses are not. The resident turns a page and reveals the version discrepancy in the randomized audit policy, the off by one number that makes the citation a misfire. A copy of the correct policy is attached, highlighted. The board's version lacks the required vote record. The president leans toward counsel. Counsel's pen stops moving. The moderator tries to push to deliberation. The veterans' observers simply keep writing. The board moves into executive session with a choreography meant to look inevitable. In the hallway, the temperature difference feels like weather-chan. Jing. Neighbors who have remained neutral avoid their phones for once. Absence of a screen is a form of presence. The resident waits without pacing, spine straight, hands quiet. When the board returns, the voice is softer, then overcompensates. The decision, the major infraction, is modified but not withdrawn. The fines are adjusted but not canceled. The attire guideline is to be reviewed by subcommittee, a concession that attempts to keep the skeleton of power intact while offering flesh as a pacifier. The president speaks of balance and fairness, of the need to maintain standards while listening to concerns. The words float, weightless, because the packet is still on the table like gravity itself. Morning arrives with the unremarkable beauty that once defined the cul-de-sac, a blue that feels scrubbed clean, the soft hush of sprinklers, the hum of garage doors waking up without ceremony. Inside the second house on the left, the binder sits open on the kitchen table next to a mug that cools slower than the adrenaline that carried the last few weeks. The inbox holds two messages that matter more than their subject lines suggest. One from the oversight body confirming interviews scheduled with every board member and counselor. Another acknowledging receipt of the veteran's statement and noting it has been entered into the case record. Quietly, a balance shifts from rumor to record, from whispers to a timeline with numbered exhibits and names attached to decisions. Within days, something else changes. Small at first, tactile in a way that speaks before anyone does. The courtesy reminder posters vanish from the clubhouse wall, replaced by a single page that lists the bylaws currently in effect and the date each was adopted, printed with unapologetic clarity. The attire clause is gone from the list, not crossed out, not deferred, absent, as if the room itself refused to hold it any longer. A second sheet appears beside it, a notice about a third-party policy review, and an invitation for residents to submit experiences related to enforcement in the last 18 months. The invitation is the opposite of what the board used to do. It asks to be watched. Refunds begin not with a lump sum, but with an accounting. A spreadsheet sent by the management company listing each fine tied to the suspended guideline, each administrative fee that piggybacked on top, and the proposed reversals with dates and transaction IDs. The numbers are not large in the grand math of mortgages and life, but they are specific. Specificity is how dignity returns. The lien process is halted in Wabi writing, not paused, not under review, halted, with a signature that can be held up against the light. For the resident, it is not about the money. It is about uncontaminating the ledger, restoring the story the bills tell. The board convenes a special meeting to announce governance changes, and this time the chairs fill not with people hoping for quick updates, but with neighbors who have decided that attendance is part of belonging. At the front, the president reads a statement that has been negotiated into carefulness. Acknowledgement of shortcomings in process, commitment to transparent votes, a promise to avoid ambiguous language that allows subjective enforcement, and a pledge to publish agendas with sufficient notice. The word apologize appears once, shy and surrounded by clauses. It is not an apology that heals. It is an apology that opens a door. Then, the unexpected. 2 board members announce resignations effective immediately, not as an admission of guilt, but as an acknowledgement that trust is a kind of capital they have spent. The president does not resign, yet. A call for nominations goes out, and names surface that had never appeared on ballots before, people whose energies go to jobs and kids and caregiving, people who rarely raise hands but have been quietly keeping the place livable. This is a more radical change than it looks. It is a redistribution of attention. The Veterans Liaison Group sends a short note of thanks to the community for the chance to clarify norms and standing and steps back without trying to stay. Their exit matters. It demonstrates that external eyes came not to occupy, but to witness, then recede. In the days that follow, more neighbors share their own small files. A notice that felt targeted here, an overlooked leeway there, patterns that confirm what seemed like isolated slights were coordinated rhythms. The third-party reviewer's portal fills with submissions. Anonymity is offered, but more people attach their names than anyone expected. Naming is a way to reclaim space. For the resident, the daily rituals resume with a new clarity. The flag rises and falls on schedule because that is how it has always been done, not because someone demanded it. The workbench returns to the comforting geometry of tools lined by function and size. The boots by the door are clean without being polished for an audience. The binder, no longer a lifeline, becomes an archive. A label is added to the spine with the dates that bracket a season the house survived. Survival is not the same as silence. The resident meets with 3 neighbors at the kitchen table and shows them how to keep records in case they ever need to, hoping they won't. Consequences arrive for the board in layers, some formal, some cultural. The oversight body completes initial interviews and issues a preliminary guidance letter recommending withdrawal of the attire guideline, reimbursement of all related fines and fees, and a review of the board's enforcement practices over the past year for consistency with the governing documents. It stops short of sanctions in the first pass, signaling that restoration is preferred to punishment, if restoration is real. The letter is public. It lives on the community website next to pool hours and holiday closures. Visibility itself becomes correction. Internally, the board's center of gravity shifts. Without 2 steady votes, the president's certainty meets friction. Motions are questioned. Consent agendas are split into individual items. Minutes acquire detail, catching the texture of decisions where once there was only gloss. The management company, stung by association, becomes meticulous in the right direction. Notices go out with highlighted citations to the exact section of the bylaws. Phrases like, could be construed, and in the spirit of, disappear from templates. In their place, the quiet dignity of accurate language. The community itself moves through an awkward season of recalibration. People who had liked the old order for the way it simplified choices find themselves learning to sit with complexity. Not every violation is equal. Not every preference deserves a rule. Not every discomfort is proof someone else is wrong. Yard sales return with handmade signs that no one measures with rulers. Holiday displays stretch a little wild at the edges, and somehow the sky does not fall. The property values, that magic phrase, do not plummet. If anything, the listings start to include a new line. Community governance recently updated for transparency, a sentence that attracts the kind of buyer who prefers neighbors to hall monitors. As for the president, consequences come not as spectacle but as erosion. Invitations to lead committees are met with polite deferrals. The newsletter stops featuring her photo at the center of every collage. She still arrives with a clipboard, but its power has diminished because the pages inside now belong to everyone. At a quarterly meeting, a resident, measured, respectful, asks whether the president plans to seek re-election in light of the oversight findings and the resignations. The question is not a trap, it is a mirror. The president answers that she will not, choosing to support the transition to a refreshed leadership team. A sentence that rescues her pride while acknowledging the room has changed in her absence. When a new board takes their seats, the first act is not to make new rules, but to prune the garden. Policies are consolidated, duplicates merged, ambiguities stripped of their hiding places. An enforcement matrix is published that pairs each rule with a clear notice process, a defined evidence standard, and a tiered response that begins with conversation and ends with consequence only when harm is real. Selective enforcement becomes mechanically harder because the machine now clicks into place only when the pieces fit. The second act is to open a standing listening hour monthly where residents can bring concerns without agenda or clock, a small structure that saves the community from the need to invent drama to be heard. Impact ripples outward in ways no one can fully track. A neighbor who had been cited for a garden gnome, once not in harmony, reinstalls it and adds a small plaque beneath that reads, "Harmony is people," a tiny, kind joke that makes children point and adults smile despite themselves. Another neighbor who kept a kayak by the fence moves it to a side yard, not because of fear, but because of a shared conversation about sightlines that it ended with agreement instead of a memo. The forum, once a place for performative virtue, becomes quieter, then more useful. When people post, they ask questions and accept answers. The shadows shrink where transparency grows. For the resident, vindication is practical. The return of common area privileges, the removal of fines from the ledger, an official letter noting the withdrawal of the attire guideline, and recognizing the residents' contributions to community events. But it is also something uncountable, a restoration of the simple act of moving through a place without being assessed by people who mistake authority for rightness. The uniform returns to the closet shelf where it has always belonged, folded the way it was taught to be, not as a statement, but as a piece of life that this neighborhood now understands it must respect. On a morning that feels like a return, the flag is raised and catches in a light that seems to approve.